Welcome to I Love to Tell the Story, a podcast on the narrative lectionary. I'm Rolf Jacobson.
I'm Catherine Schifferdecker.
And I'm Craig Kester.
This is the podcast for March 5th, 2025, and it's Ash Wednesday. And the story is Luke, or the passage rather, is Luke 9, 51 through 62. And most important in the passage is the way it starts, is when the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go toward Jerusalem. So this is, it's Transfiguration ends Epiphany, which is the first half of the Synoptic Gospels. Really, Epiphany, it's the manifestation of the Son of God in history. And then it turns as the journey now goes to Jerusalem, and we get Lent. One thing about this, the Gospel of Luke that is so interesting is that Jerusalem is more than just the city where Jesus is going to die. It's there throughout the narrative so that it almost becomes a character. That Luke 1 starts in the temple with Zechariah and in the Annunciation of John's birth. And then early on, Jesus' parents go up there, when he's 12. And then at the very end of the narrative, after Easter, the whole thing ends with the disciples constantly praising God in the temple. And so it's more than just a location. It's really symbolically and narratively important. And what do you make of that, you guys?
I think in terms of the trajectory in Luke, Luke is certainly rooting the story of Jesus in Israel's tradition. Going back to this pivotal central city in Israel's history. Going all the way back to David making it his capital, making it the place where the sanctuary would be, bringing the ark there, Solomon building the temple, and so on. That he's rooting it there, but then also it becomes the harbinger of taking that story further. You're given a glimpse of that at the end where they're back in Jerusalem, they're praising God in the temple and waiting for the power from on high to come. And then in Acts, boom, you're off and you're going out from Jerusalem. The preaching is supposed to be go out from Jerusalem to all nations. And that's where the whole story of Acts goes, with that community in Jerusalem being really the fountainhead then from which the gospel message goes out. So there is that dynamic quality of what is salvation being rooted in Israel's story, Jerusalem being the embodiment of that, and then, but it's for all nations. And that becomes the trajectory that Luke will take it on in the book of Acts.
There's a sense in which Jerusalem has to be the place where important things happen, maybe is the way to put it, maybe not so eloquently. But it really is such a central place, right? You mentioned, of course, David making it the capital, bringing the ark, and then the temple, right? The temple really is that central place where heaven and earth meet, right? This is the place where God is present to the people. It's like Mount Sinai, right? Mount Zion. Zion, of course, being another name for Jerusalem. This is the place where God meets the people. And so for Jesus to set his face to go to Jerusalem, there's something significant that's going to happen there.
He's just in the recently, the way we ended last week, he said he's going to be the Son of Man will be turned over, will be betrayed,
right.
And there's a little that comes in between because there's something really weird about the next part that happens immediately after this. But I think what I want to say first is this is a story about discipleship. It's a call to discipleship because in a minute you're going to get this strange thing where the one guy says, "I'll follow you wherever you go," and he says, strange response: foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And another, he says, "Follow me. First, Lord, let me go bury my father." Really strange stories. And before it, an even more strange story. They're on the way through Samaria, and because Jesus has his face set towards Jerusalem, they won't receive him. And then James and John, I don't know what to make of this. Lord, you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Like, well, I didn't know you could do that. Why did they think they could do that?
Yeah. Maybe just a few things. Let's pick up where you left off and then work our way forward.
Perfect.
How about that? Okay. Obviously, they're doing a lot of play on the fact that Jerusalem was located in the southern part of the country. Samaria is in the central part of the country, formerly the northern kingdom. The city of Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom. And when the kingdom split into north and south, temple, that's south. That's David. That's those folks. Up in the north, we've got our own sanctuaries here in the north. We don't go there. There was a long history of antipathy between the Samaritans further north and the Judeans further south. And so to go from Galilee in the way north to Jerusalem in the way south, you'd go through Samaria, and it was like going through a neighborhood you don't want to be in after dark. There was a lot of hostility, and it went both ways. I mean, there had been Jewish leaders by this point who had been brutal to some of the folks of Samaria. There had been Samaritan retaliation, brutal atrocities committed by Samaritans against Jews, long history of antagonism. And so going to Jerusalem meant you are one of them, you're not one of us, and we don't want you here. As he's going, it's interesting that some of the prophets who worked in the northern kingdom were Elijah and Elisha. And of course, who were great at calling down fire from heaven? Well, Elijah was, you want a fiery prophet, you go to Elijah. I mean, call it right down on Mount Carmel. Beginning of 2 Kings. I mean, you got some messengers going to Elijah. He says, fire from heaven comes down, devours them. I mean, you get somebody's really being rude to you. I mean, hey, you got road rage? They've got road rage. Hey, somebody, what do you mean? Hey, I'd love to call down fire from heaven on you. Unfortunately, way too human a thing. I mean, say, we want to do the Elijah thing. We'll call down fire from heaven. Or zap, you won't let us through here. You're cutting the road in front of us. I'm sorry. Not a pretty picture of discipleship.
No.
Unfortunately, way too realistic. So that's kind of where Jesus is located. Rejected on the one hand and got ticked off disciples on the other. Man, talk about, and now he's going to his death. I mean, it's like he can't even get to the crucifixion because he's dealing with all this other junk en route. Not a pretty picture that he's facing here.
And then, I'll follow you wherever you go. That makes sense now, response. A village has just not received him. And he goes, hey, I don't even have any place to stay tonight.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
There makes better sense.
Yeah, there it's going. And so he's talking about really the nature of discipleship there. And it's because for discipleship to be lived at ground level, he's dealing with both conflict on the outside with the Samaritans. He's dealing with major issues inside, in which his disciples are acting on impulses that aren't really pretty. My gosh, does this sound like church life? I mean, do we have issues outside? Do we have issues inside? I mean, are we dealing with things internally that aren't always so pretty? I think so. And what Jesus is doing is calling a way forward that recognizes the starkness of what it means to follow a commitment that can face rejection on the one hand, that doesn't give way to the impulses for revenge on the other, but is the way of fidelity that recognizes just how lonely that can be, how much out of sync that can really feel, in which you really don't belong.
So three comments / questions. One is I hadn't thought about the Elijah, Elisha with the calling down on fire. But I did think of, so thank you for that. I did think about the putting your hand to the plow, and then Elijah, encounters Elisha plowing the field, right? Puts his cloak on him.
Yep.
Elijah says, Elisha left the ox and ran after Elijah and said, "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you."
Mm-hmm. There you go.
And Elijah says, "Go back again for what I've done to you." And then he ends up sacrificing the yoke of oxen and using the equipment to boil their flesh. So an obvious reference back to that. Again, what does it mean to be a disciple? So there are obvious references back to the Old Testament. I'm going to ask this, both of you, really, what to make of this, because I know some of our listeners, I'm sure, are asking the same thing. So when the second guy says, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father," that seems like a pretty reasonable, pretty reasonable request. But Jesus says, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but as for you, go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Like, what do you do with that? And then, before I lose it, the third question. Obviously, this is for Ash Wednesday. We need to bring it back to Ash Wednesday. But is the second would-be disciple saying, "Wait till my father dies and then I'll follow you"? Or, I mean, we don't know, I suppose. But it seems like a reasonable request.
It does, yeah. In terms of my reading of the story, there are a couple things. One is, as Jesus is talking about the cost of discipleship, really. I think this is not the only place he engages in hyperbole. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Really?
Right.
And I think this is, if anything, he's kind of moving into the hyperbole about what does it mean to be committed to the future, rather than there's always something more important that gets in the way. I think he's using hyperbole at this point. The other thing, as he's thinking about it, one of the lenses through which I read this story is actually musical. That's one of my go-to places. Sometimes the songwriters actually provide the hermeneutical lens for me. And one of the songs that actually brought this text into perspective for me was it's a spiritual, African-American spiritual.
I'm wondering if it's the same one that I've had in my mind.
Paul and Silas locked in jail, didn't have no one to go their bail. Keep your hand on the plow, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on the plow, hold on. And what that spiritual does is to speak about a context in which it's, better count the cost, better count the cost, better count the cost, rather to say, I'm in it. And what are the options? Perseverance is hold on. That becomes the realistic way forward. That becomes the shape that faith takes, because the alternative to that is despair. Paul and Silas are locked in jail. Jesus isn't saying, "Well, you want to come into jail?" That's where we're at. We're dealing with conflict on the outside. We're dealing with misunderstanding on the inside. Right before this, we're dealing with all kinds of stuff that makes discipleship. We're in it. The question is, how do you move through it? And I think that's the key thing for an Ash Wednesday is, folks, if you're here listening to this sermon on Ash Wednesday, we're in it. We're in it together. And the question is, where does it go from here? That faith becomes not simply a pious act of trust or a pie in the sky kind of thing. It becomes a realistic act of perseverance, saying that the path to which we are called is not an easy one. And at the same time, we're following a Lord who is there with us, who is going ahead of us, who is making a way towards that future that God has for us, that we were given a glimpse of a couple of days ago in the Transfiguration, which we don't see now. But it becomes a summons, keep your hand on the plow, hold on. There are lots of things that are holding you captive, but God's not done yet.
That is exactly the song I was thinking of. And when you look at the verse, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back. I think about two things about my grandpa used to plow behind an ox. Kids today would not have any idea what that plow looked like. But you can't plow if you're looking backwards.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can't plow unless your hands keep your hands on the plow. It's not something. Discipleship is not something that you can take lightly. The way somebody might driving a car, you can kind of glance away for a little while and it'll track straight. And I do think that in terms of following and being a disciple every day, which might be a pretty good theme for Lent, especially with some of the stories coming, that it's a daily thing that requires constant attention.
I Love to Tell the Story is a production of Luther Seminary's Working Preacher. The narrative lectionary was developed at Luther Seminary and has been hosted on Working Preacher since 2011. Find episodes and links at workingpreacher.org/narrative. And be sure to rate, subscribe, and comment on YouTube. Thanks for joining us.